Bom, gente, muito obrigado por vir, e vocês que estão online vendo a gente também. Eu dou boas-vindas para vocês nesse segundo dia de atividades com o professor Julian Manley aqui no Unicamp. O professor Manley é professor da Universidade de Central Lancashire, no Reino Unido. Ele tem experiência em psicologia social, embora, como vocês vão ver aqui, ele tem uma abordagem que é bastante interdisciplinar. Ele tem interesse particular na maneira como a psicologia e nossas dimensões afetivas impactam e são impactadas por eventos de crise, sobretudo no caso da crise climática. Ele também tem envolvimento em iniciativas alternativas de governança no Reino Unido para lidar com problemas relacionados à dissolução de comunidades e reação a crises. Esse evento, para aqueles de vocês que estão chegando agora, que não conhecem esse projeto, é parte de um projeto maior que a gente está envolvido aqui na Unicamp, de estudo a reações humanas a episódios de crise, eventos extremos, especificamente ambientais, mas de outras naturezas também. Isso está ligado a um projeto maior da FAPESP, um projeto temático chamado História Conectada da Idade Média, do qual vários de nós aqui somos pesquisadores, e que tentam entender, entre outras coisas, como esses fenômenos que às vezes ultrapassam a cognição de indivíduos ou de pequenas localidades, esses fenômenos maiores interconectados, podem acabar afetando o nosso entendimento de fenômenos históricos. Eu gostaria de reforçar que o professor Manley está aqui, na verdade, para uma bateria de exercícios. Nós vamos ter quase 3 semanas de exercícios como parte desse projeto. Então, o que vocês vão ver aqui hoje é um pedaço dessa linha de pensamento, dessa reflexão conjunta que a gente vai estar conduzindo ao longo dos dias. Então, vou dar agora a palavra ao professor. Julian, the floor is yours, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you. So, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you to the University of Unicamp and to the Professor Neri de Barros Almeida for organising a very interesting research and teaching and learning project. I'm also very humbled to be able to speak to you in English, my native tongue, while the audience maybe has a native tongue in Brazilian Portuguese. I do appreciate the effort that people make to speak and to listen to an English speaker who can't speak Portuguese. So thank you very much. So I'm going to talk today about the way the psychosocial can help us to reconceptualize memory and reconceptualize ideas of perception in the context of actions that are required for tackling and coping with the climate emergency. It's well known, I think, that despite the facts related to climate change, there's very little in terms of positive action and actual results in bringing down carbon emissions, in improving the situation in the face of climate change. And so what psychosocial approaches try to do is they try to understand the reasons, the unconscious reasons, the reasons that haven't yet been perceived or thought about or reflected upon, which might give us an idea as to why, despite the facts related to climate change, why is it that we find it so difficult to So, as an introduction, I'd like to bring up a recent paper by Neri de Barros Almeida, which proposes to analyze the way in which Vianney records the reaction to the crisis and how his exposition could be understood as a testimony to the conditions for the reaction to the crisis in the city of Florence in the 14th century. And the paper discusses how the reaction to the crisis and the risk of crisis is shaped by the tension between present facts, political context, and social memory. And I think it's really important to try to understand history as well as other matters in terms of what these things mean to us in the present, and to question the idea of history as being lost in some faded past, which maybe for some people isn't relevant to us today. In fact, if you can approach history from a different perspective, if you can approach history aside from the facts rooted in the past, if you can understand, as is pointed out here, that the importance of history might be in the reactions, the reflections, the thoughts, the feelings of people, of the protagonists within a historical event, then maybe the history is something that we can genuinely learn about and apply to the present context. So, I mean, you know, what is a historical record? If you're living in my country, the United Kingdom, you always begin with the kings and queens of the United Kingdom. So William I, William the Conqueror, conquered England from Normandy in France in 1066. William II, 1087, Henry I, 1100, etc. So, you know, at school, what we learned about were the kings and queens and the linear trajectory of their reigns. Another thing we learned about were the important battles and the wars. The Battle of Arbela, the Battle of Marathon, etc., set out in a linear sequence of battles and wars. And of course, that particular way of understanding history tells us next to nothing about what the meanings are for people in the past, in the present, and in the future. And as the slide indicates here, questions are, how and why did people live in the way they lived in those times? In other words, if you go back to the paper we discussed in the first slide, how did people react to the flooding in Italy in those days? How did they react? Why did they react? And what can we learn about human reactions from the past to the present? Because, of course, time moves on, but people remain people. So there's a sort of difference between the physical movement of time and the emotional stability of people. So this is one of the things that is important to understand in terms of reassessing and reconceptualizing historical thought and memory of historical thought. So to give you an example from climate change, this is a helpful study from climate science. And although it's helpful, it's very limited. And it's limited in the same way as the kings and queens of England are limited, as the battles are limited. So here's the helpful information from Kokik, Howden and Crimp in 2014. So July 2014 was the 353rd consecutive month in which global land and ocean average surface temperature exceeded the 20th century monthly average. The last time the global average surface temperature fell below that 20th century monthly average was February 1985, as reported by the US-based National Climate Data Center. And then Kovic et al. Continued. Our analysis showed that the probability of getting the same run of warmer than average months without the human influence was less than 1 chance in 100,000. So this is important information, but it's information based on statistics and probability. The probability of what's going to happen according to statistics, and it gives us quite a dramatic result of 353 months of higher than average temperatures. But I think the question is, you would like to think that with this factual information, with this terrible information, isn't it obvious that we need to deal with climate change? The facts are clear, therefore we must act, right? Well, no, not right. That's the problem. The problem is not in the facts. The problem is the reaction to the facts. And this is a fantastic example of how that works. So that's the reason for attempting to use psychosocial approaches to understand why rather than what. So the fact that 353 consecutive months of warmer than average temperatures is a what, but there's no idea about why this happens and why we don't react to these facts. And only proving the what is clearly not enough. So in this lecture, I'm going to discuss memory and history as memory, therefore located in the self and not just in the archive. So it's important to understand that what's in the archive as a documented record becomes a living record as soon as you read it. As soon as you read the record becomes part of the reader, part of the human being, and in some sense becomes embodied within. So we're going to think about this from a psychosocial perspective in order to apply historical knowledge to the present. Now, that is absolutely key, of course. And psychologically speaking, it's important to understand that although when we say the word history, we think past, this is something that we have to change. We have to change that particular perspective. So when we talk about history, in this lecture at least, we're talking as much about the present as we are about the past. So the time of historical memory is not the same as the linear line of time, as people like the French philosopher, well, the two French philosophers, Henri Bergson and Michel Foucault, have pointed out in various works. And neither is history the story of unlimited progress, as demonstrated again by Michel Foucault and by Thomas Kuhn's seminal work on the revolutions in science, the structure of revolutions. And both of those things are vital to understanding why we don't cope with climate change despite the facts. So ultimately, our focus is on understanding how these perspectives can contribute to a more profound, and if it's more profound, presumably more impactful and authentic view of climate change, something authentic. In other words, what is more authentic than a fact? You might say that a fact is the ultimate in authenticity, but clearly it's not, because the fact doesn't create the action required to deal with the fact. So authenticity includes the fact, but there's something missing apart from the fact. So a more profound and authentic view of climate change and the potential success or otherwise of action in this field. And the psychosocial lens, by the way, is a wide-angle lens. So the lens is also philosophical and also historical as part of a complex psychosocial approach. And you'll hear me say the word complex several times in this lecture, because another reason for the difficulty of climate change and the difficulty of understanding why we don't act in the face of climate change is the complexity of climate change. And the complexity of climate change is reflected in the complexity of the human being. And we forget that the human being is not a simple fact. And climate change is not a simple fact either. And yet, climate science and even the social sciences and the hard sciences, anything that you call science, attempts to reduce complexity to something simple, so that that simple thing can be analyzed and can be verified and can be replicated and validated. But the problem with that, the problem with simplicity, is that neither human beings, nor human systems, nor climate systems are simple. And so the simple approach is not appropriate for complex situations. So before continuing, I think it's probably worth explaining a little bit about what the psychosocial approach is. It contains two words, psychology or psychoanalysis and social. And the idea of the psyche is associated with the individual human being and internal processes within a human being. And the social is, of course, the social body, the communities that form up groups and teams and organizations of people. So the psychosocial understands psychoanalysis as a way of thinking. So it's a way of thinking. It can be applied beyond the clinical duality of psychoanalysis by working towards structures of feeling, which is a famous term coined by Raymond Williams, that create social and political movements. So that's the first aspect of the psychosocial. Secondly, so the psychosocial accepts the reality of an unconscious. Now, the idea of the unconscious is a very difficult question, and it's often challenged by many people. Sometimes scientists regard the unconscious as being something mystical and something unscientific. We haven't got time to discuss that in this lecture, only to say that if you take a psychosocial approach, you take for granted that the unconscious exists. And not only that, the unconscious exists both individually and socially. Okay? So it's held individually and in relationships in groups and society, thus significantly influencing the way people process decision making. And you have there immediately a clue as to why we're not dealing with the facts of climate change. Well, it's because when people make decisions, they don't make decisions based only on facts. They make decisions based on certain unconscious motivations, ideas, thoughts and feelings which are not often expressed. Thirdly, the psychosocial gives value to affect, feelings and emotions as sources of experience knowledge. Well, affect, which is the entire complex, embodied way of understanding the world of feelings and emotions, that is something which is specifically rejected by hard science and by scientists. You don't want emotions to interfere with your study. So the psychosocial is saying, well, what would happen to our perceptions, what would happen to our ideas if actually we considered affect, we considered feelings, and we considered emotions as being important sources of knowledge beyond intellectual cognition? Thirdly, the psychosocial embraces the transdisciplinary, especially philosophy and anthropology, the creative and performing arts, and sociology. The point about taking things from the psyche of individuals and human beings and the social is that it's impossible to reduce it to a very narrow focus. And so other disciplines naturally come into a psychosocial approach. And fifth, in the context of the present discussion here on history and memory and the psychosocial and climate change, climate psychology is a branch of the psychosocial. And the whole idea of climate psychology has been given birth in the last 10 years, the last decade, in the United Kingdom, and now in the United States and in different places in Europe, after the creation of the Climate Psychology Alliance in the UK by Professor Paul Hoggett and colleagues in Bristol, in the University of the West of England, 10, 11 or 12 years ago. And since then, climate psychology has become a recognized aspect of psychosocial approaches thinking. So I'd like now to discuss Henri Bergson's philosophy. Bergson, recognized very often as the philosopher of time and the philosopher of memory, lived in the late 19th and early 20th century, and very influential in the work of Gilles Deleuze later on in the second half of the 20th century. So here we have a historical image of Henri Bergson, definitely set in time. The first simple question which we can ask ourselves, even without thinking of Henri Bergson, is what is memory? And what is the relationship between memory and perception? So a standard definition of memory is something you remember from the past. And a standard definition of perception is an awareness of things through the physical senses, especially the eyes, sight. But immediately, as soon as you stop and think about it for a little bit, you can see that in that case, memory would be relegated to the past only, and perception to the pure sight of objects, as if objects could be perceived entirely as they are, and as if memory could be located in the past without any connection to the present. And clearly, you only have to think about this for a little bit before you realize the absurdity of these things. But it's a fantastic example of how society accepts simple definitions as if they were facts. And that's a very damaging way of approaching our thinking processes. And so Bergson, in his famous oeuvre, Matter and Memory, saw these commonly held distinctions as being overly simplistic. And it's not difficult to agree with him. So in terms of perception, Bergson said these things. He said that there's no pure perception except in philosophical theory, but in practice, there's no pure perception. And I think that the distinction between theory and practice is also essential. So in theory, in climate change, if you have the facts, as we saw in the slides at the beginning, about climate change, and if you have the facts backed up and supported by 99.9% of climate scientists, then it's obvious that things should happen in practice, but it doesn't. It remains in theory. And so it's important for scholarship, for academic scholarship, to understand the meaning of application and practice and experience beyond the world of intellectual theory and cognition. And I think this is a little example of how that works. So there's no pure perception except in theory, because things and objects can't be seen without interference. This in itself, of course, questions the validity of hard science. And hard science has its roots in René Descartes, in Cartesian paradigms of cause and effect, of the idea that human beings can be understood in terms of machines, of things that are connected together. And that unfortunate observation by Descartes, who thinks that if I think, I am. And of course, all of these things lead to the idea that science, pure science, can take on board objective results through observation. And what Manley Bergson is saying is, actually, no, you can't, because observation or perception is never pure and is never factual. He says, the object perceived is an image that combines other images, thoughts, and associations. And this is happening all the time. Thank goodness there is a difference between artificial intelligence, between robots and human beings. If I see something, and if you see something, you don't just see the something. If I hold this bottle, and if I look at this bottle, I don't just see the recycled plastic and the H2O water inside the bottle. I can feel the coldness of the bottle. I can imagine what it reminds me of. I might associate it to the heat of Brazil, for example. It makes me think possibly of the purity of water in the taps in the bathroom. It makes me imagine where it might have come from, the spring, for example, in some beautiful place. I can't just see the bottle. With the bottle comes other images, thoughts, and associations. So that image is also impregnated with affect and emotions. I can't not have a feeling when I observe something because I am a human being. Therefore, anything that I see, I associate to other images, but also I have feelings. I have different feelings come to me associated with what I see. And so an important element of the combinations that make up perception, and this is a key aspect of this particular talk, perception is connected to memory, okay? In this way, memory from the past becomes the here and now from the present. And in this little diagram here by Henri Bergson from his book, the point at the bottom of the plane, the S point, is the point of perception. And in the funnel, you receive memory, images, affect, and all of those things, they have different levels, but they all lead to the point of perception. So that perception is not pure perception. Perception is multifarious. So Bergson says it's complex. As I said at the beginning, complexity is a vital thing to accept. We don't want to accept complexity in our thinking because it's complex, but there's no choice if we want to make progress. So he says that memory is the intersection of mind and matter. And what he means by that is the imagination and the potential of the mind of each person. And by matter, he means the things, the objects that you see in front of you and that you can touch. So memory is the intersection of these things in the mind and the things that are out there, the objects, the matter. So he gives an example. Take a complex thought which unrolls itself in a chain of abstract reasoning. And just the very words, abstract reasoning, seem to be contradictory, because the whole point of philosophy and the whole point of clinical science is to understand things in a way which is not abstract. If it's abstract, it doesn't make clear sense. But he's talking here about complex ideas which combine abstraction and reasoning. This thought is accompanied by images. So there is no pure thought. And in the work of scholars and academics throughout the world, there's this idea that because we work with language, because we work with words, because we write articles and so on, that's what it is. That is the pure reasoning. But actually, it's a false idea because all our thoughts are associated to images. There's hardly a thought that exists without an image. And the images themselves are not pictured in consciousness without some foreshadowing, says Bergson, in the form of a sketch or a tendency. So there's no purity in thought. Then he goes on to say, but as soon as the person attempts to connect the present with the past and to foretell the future, this person is obliged to replace all the images on the same plane. So we might theoretically think of the present, the past, and the future. But if we think about all of these at one time, all of them, future, past, and present, become one single thought. And with that thought, they become images. And with the images, they become affect. So you have an image, an affect, a thought in one concept of time, which combines past, present, and future, is what Bergson is saying. And finally, another quotation from this book by Bergson: there is no perception which is not full of memories. With the immediate and present data of our senses, we mingle 1,000 details of our past experience. So, in terms of affect, which is a very important concept in discussing thought processes, Bergson, in his perception of his present, inherits Spinoza from the past and foretells the future of Deleuzian philosophy, but without depending on a linear thought process. So Baruch Spinoza, the famous philosopher contemporary of Descartes, lived before Bergson. Bergson lived after Spinoza. Deleuze lived after Bergson. But that's not the same as saying it's a linear process, because in fact, there's more of a linear process in Cartesian thinking than there is in thinking connected to affect from Spinoza to Bergson to Deleuze. And this reflects the fact that history is absolutely not a linear process. That history is much more similar to what Kuhn talked about, sporadic revolutions in thought. A good example of that would be the sudden emergence of the theory of evolution by Darwin. It doesn't come from a gradual process of linear thinking towards evolution. It's a sudden enlightenment. And Spinoza thought these things and then they were forgotten. Bergson picked them up and then he was a little bit forgotten. And then Deleuze has reignited it. So they are small revolutions in time, not progressive linear processes in time. So the importance of affect is vital to any thinking that is connected to Baruch Spinoza, Henri Bergson, and of course in the world today, the fabulously relevant and important work of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. But affect, as I mentioned before, but it's worth mentioning again, affect is specifically rejected by science because you don't want affect in your thinking. You want your thinking to be pure and theoretical. You don't want your thinking to be contaminated by irrelevant emotions and feelings. But I mean, this is a futile pursuit, and it's one of the reasons we have so much trouble in dealing with climate change. According to Bergson's book, Matter and Memory, we have to take into account the fact that our body is not a mathematical point in space. I suppose that's obvious, isn't it? But that's the way Cartesian thinking produces statistical evidence, by not considering the quality of the human and reducing the human to statistical facts or mathematical points in space. Its virtual actions are complicated by and impregnated with real actions, things that actually happen, experience, things that are experienced by people and received by the body and the mind as cognitive experience from the body through the nervous system in relation with ourselves and with other people. In other words, there is no perception without affection. So there's no perception without memory. There's no perception, therefore, without history. There's no perception without images. And there's no perception without affect. Now, that's a complicated way of seeing perception. And you can see that if people perceive their lives, including all of these things, you can see how the simple fact of 353 consecutive warmer than average months might not have any effect on someone because they have other things they're thinking of. For example, some people where I live in the United Kingdom, they think that it's good that we have global warming because England's such a cold and horrible place that if we have a little bit of increased warmth, that's a good thing. That's affect. That's affect. Affection then, that part of aspect of the inside of our body, which we mix with the image of external bodies. And this is one of the principal features of the psychosocial, the idea that we are not unique individual bodies. There's a philosopher called Andy Clark who says we are not skin bags, all right? We have no boundary, no genuine boundary between us and the environment. We're in constant discussion with the environment. And if the environment didn't exist, we wouldn't exist. So we have to remove the idea of the individual, the person who exists by itself, and understand that we exist in relationship with the environment. So the psyche and embodiment then, again, according to Bergson, there are diverse tones of mental life. So mental life in itself is not something you can easily define in a concrete way. Mental life has nuances, has tones, a bit like a musical instrument. It's not just one sound, it's many sounds put together. And if you play the piano, maybe you can play 6 or 7 sounds at once, or maybe one, and maybe you can play one sound loudly and one sound softly, etc. So is mental life. Mental life is like that as well. Our psychic life may be lived at different heights. Tall, middle, low, different heights, different moments. It moves all the time. The tones and nuances are shifting all the time. The heights, the highs, the lows, the middles are moving all the time. Sometimes they're nearer to action and now further removed from it. In other words, theory is not enough. Experience and action and practicalities of existence are important in addition to theory. So these things, our mental life, our psyche, they shift according to the degree of our attention to life, not according to our degree of attention to our ideas about theory, no, according to the degree of our attention to life, according to Bergson. And he continues, he's saying, according to the nature of the play, so he brings the metaphor of a play into his discussion, the theatre. According to the nature of the play that is being acted, the movements of the players tell us more or less about it. So if you think of a theatre play, if you think of reading a play, reading Shakespeare, for example, you need to understand at the same time that you haven't got the experience of the play, because the play is about the exterior movement of objects and the interior thinking of the words. They are combined. And what we often do in life is to separate them. And this example by Bergson demonstrates the absolute validity of combining the interior with the exterior. So, in a play, the movements of the players tell us more or less about it. It tells us everything if it's a pantomime. So if it's a silent play, a pantomime, then we would never understand it with the book, because the physical external movements tell us the play. And if it's a delicate comedy, if the importance of the play is in the words, then the movement of the players is not the most important thing. And if you combine the words with the movements, then you have the holistic understanding of the play. And he uses this metaphor precisely to emphasize that in order to think about things, we need to consider the internal thinking and feeling processes and the way the internal processes of each individual are connected to the external processes that surround us. So we can move on now to applying some of these ideas to climate psychology. What's the relevance of Bergson to climate psychology then? History, memory, perception. So the traditional form of thought in the Western or Western influenced structures is focused on the use of language. What we do is we imitate a scientific paradigm, which I'm equating with a Cartesian paradigm, which places a maximum emphasis on objectivity through observation, validated by replicability. That's the scientific process. An idea or hypothesis in science exists to be proved or disproved. It either is or it isn't. Climate psychology and the psychosocial, however, admits to different tones, nuances in perception, and opens out the possibility of a multiplicity of answers to diverse questions. In other words, when we ask ourselves, why do people not take any notice of climate facts? There are going to be many, many answers to that question, a multiplicity of answers. There isn't a single answer to that question. But of course, you can see that that's frustrating for the Cartesian paradigm. It's frustrating for the scientific approach, because the scientific approach is always aiming for a simple, single, observable, objective answer to a hypothesis or question. It doesn't exist in the area of understanding climate change. And that's a fundamental fact, if you like, which we haven't yet approached. So there are a multiplicity of answers to diverse questions as the images of perceptions mingle with memory and affect and oscillate, if you remember Bergson's funnel. They oscillate before they get to the point of perception. They oscillate between the internal and the external. And this provides a window to complexity which otherwise is blind to us as a hyper-object. So the philosopher Timothy Morton coined the term hyper-object and uses the word hyper-object to describe climate change. And the purpose of the word hyper-object is to demonstrate that the problem of climate change is so enormous, it's so huge, it's so difficult to perceive that it is an object, but it's a hyper-object. It's so big, it's so complex that you can't see it. You know it exists, but you can't see it. And what Timothy Morton says is you can only see the symptoms. You can't see the entire climate change problem. You can only see aspects. So, for example, if your river floods because of torrential rain as a result of climate change, you can see the symptom of climate change, but the flooding is not climate change. The flooding is an aspect of climate change. And that is such a difficult thing to tackle, particularly because it's difficult in itself. You actually can't see it. It's difficult in itself. But also, it goes against the scientific approach, which tells us we must reduce things to simplicity and observe them to come to a conclusion. So it's full of difficulties. And we need to accept the difficulties if we're going to make progress in tackling climate change. In psychosocial approaches, the hypothesis is never more than a working hypothesis. So in the simple scientific paradigm, the hypothesis is either proved or is disproved. But from a complex psychosocial approach, you might have ideas, you might have theories, you might create a hypothesis, but that hypothesis doesn't exist to be proved or disproved. That hypothesis exists to enable the progression of thought and the continuation of thinking, and that's why you might call it a working hypothesis. And so, if you take on board all of these things, there is definitely a problem with seeing things in a linear fashion. So history, whether it's archival history, which interestingly enough, Michel Foucault was an archivist, or if it's personal history, in other words, your memory also has a history, a personal history is related to your memory. It's often viewed in a linear and progressive fashion. And this was challenged by Foucault's reconceptualization of histories through archival study. Instead of a continuous progression of civilization, it's compared to madness in Foucault's seminal work, Madness and Civilization. For example, in Foucault's work, the civilized logic of the development of lunatic asylums, places where you put mad people away from society, becomes the projection of individuals and the excitement of affect that comes from othering. What Foucault was saying was if you look at the specific dialogues, if you look at the specific documents in the archives that document the development of lunatic asylums, instead of a clear logic about lunatic asylums and the need to put mad people in another place, he talks about how people might get excited and satisfied with themselves when they go to the lunatic asylum and they observe the mad people, and they say to themselves, oh, I'm not mad, they're mad. Okay? And so the reason for the lunatic asylum is not necessarily a sign of civilization and progress with a genuine logical reason for doing this, but it could be related to the way people are excited and like to preserve their own individual integrity by calling those people who are not like me lunatics, and finding it funny, for example, the way a mad person behaves, and being relieved and satisfied that I am not mad. And of course, we're not going to go into this now, but of course you can see how problems of racism, for example, can come out of that way of thinking. I am not the poor black person who comes from slavery. I am a part of the elite. I like it. I like to other the person because it makes me feel better. That kind of psychology is the psychology that Foucault talks about when he discusses the validity or otherwise of the lunatic asylum. So history, for Foucault, is viewed in terms of excavating strata of archaeology. So he talks about history as if it were archaeology, as if history is more about excavating downwards in one place as opposed to traveling along a linear path. And he says it's important to understand the specifics of discourse in, for example, archival documents, and to understand contradictions instead of trying to make it all sound as if it fits into the progress of history. And these things, these documents, these specific documents, they lie on top of each other like stratas in an archaeological site. And the idea of history as archaeology is very much an idea that resonates with the Deleuzian sense of plateaus. And, you know, as you may know, that very famous book by Deleuze-Guattari, 1,000 Plateaus, is all about how knowledge and understanding is located in terms of things on top of each other that can emerge and recede according to how we perceive them. And connected to 1,000 plateaus is the idea of rhizomatic structures, structures of rhizomes, as opposed to structures of linear process and linear thought. That's a relief to see a nice picture. And that picture, of course, provides a view of the stratas, a view of the plateaus that can help us to understand the idea of 1,000 plateaus, the idea of how rhizomes might work, the idea of history as archaeology. So in the present, you see the plateaus, and if you don't see them, you know that they're there. And the idea associated to that, of course, is the idea of the rhizome, that thinking and cognition as affect, as opposed to cognition as intellectual theory, can move in many directions. So thinking does not move in a linear, narrow, guided fashion. Thinking moves in many directions all at once, and often thinking is governed by affect, not intellect. Okay, and that's one of the principal aspects of Deleuzian thought. And what these images show are that if you imagine these plants, the top part of the plant appears to be symmetrical, and it appears to be logical and clear. It has a center, and from the center of each plant, similar branches branch out, but below ground, the rhizome of each plant is not symmetrical. It's twisted up and entangled in all different kinds of ways. And what Deleuze is saying is, look, we might think that things are simple and clear and theoretical and intellectual, just like the top part of the plants, but actually we're not like that. Things are more like the rhizomes below the plant, that our thinking is like rhizomatic thinking, not clear, simple, logical thinking. And that, of course, will help us understand why we don't take action with climate change, because we're thinking rhizomatically, we're not thinking clearly in the way that climate scientists try to think. We're thinking in different ways. So, having said all that, I'm going to make a statement. And this is an ontological statement. So, having thought about these things in this lecture so far, I would like to suggest this. If thinking is multiple and unpredictably rhizomatic, if the past of historical memory synthesizes with present perception, if embodied affect is part of knowledge, but often unconsciously held, and if the boundary between subject and object is permeable, then we need to engage with different ways of thinking, feeling, and taking decisions in society. So this, I think, is a suitable conclusion to what I've been discussing in the lecture so far. And furthermore, ignoring this leads to the simplification of complexity and the dilemma of the climate emergency. And this leads to the idea of ecology. Ecology is a word which is coming more and more into fashion. You see more and more statements that talk about ecological systems, and I'm not surprised, because even if many people don't realize it, the idea of ecology provides us a means of escaping from the trap of simplified thinking. So ecology is connected to the idea of holism. And holism, holistic visions, are in fact psychosocial visions. The psychosocial needs to embrace a holistic way of understanding things. And this way of understanding things, the ecological way, which is very similar to the rhizomatic way, the ecological way of understanding things is true if truth can be defined. It's as true, it's differently true as the truth of a scientific discovery. It's a different kind of truth, but it's as true and probably more useful than scientific truth. And there's a quotation here from a marvelous book by Felix Guattari, who wrote with Gilles Deleuze at the end of the 20th century. And after Deleuze's death, Felix Guattari continued writing. And he wrote this marvelous book, which I can highly recommend, called The Three Ecologies. And he says in this book, quotation from this book, "If no remedy is found, the ecological disequilibrium this has generated will ultimately threaten the continuation of life on the planet's surface. Kinship networks tend to be reduced to a bare minimum. Domestic life is being poisoned by the gangrene of mass media consumption. Family and married life are frequently ossified by a sort of standardization of behavior, and neighborhood relations are generally reduced to their meanest expression. It is the relationship between subjectivity and exteriority, be it social, animal, vegetable, or cosmic, that is compromised in this way. Politicians are generally content to simply tackle ecological issues from a purely technocratic perspective, whereas only an ethico-political articulation, which Felix Guattari calls ecosophy, ecology and philosophy, between the three ecological registers, the environment, social relations, and human subjectivity, would be likely to clarify these questions. Now, to me, that is a fascinating, relevant statement from Felix Guattari. And there are two things to note about it. One of them is the date. Felix Guattari wrote this in 1989, which is amazing because I think that many people would agree that this statement is precisely relevant to us today. And yet, what progress has been made between this statement written in 1989 and where we stand today in 2024? So, I mean, there's a lot of thinking to be done about that. Secondly, there's a famous philosopher called Arne Næss, who is noted for working on deep ecology. And for Arne Næss, he didn't like this definition because he liked to think of ecology as being related only to nature and the environment. And so instead of people accepting this kind of approach as being important and relevant, some purists in ecology said, no, we can't accept this because ecology can't include social relations and can't include human subjectivity. Ecology is about nature and the environment. And so you can see how academic scholarship can get in the way of progress by inventing problems in the definition of ecology. Certainly, from a psychosocial perspective, the combination of the so-called three ecologies is vital. And if we took on board human subjectivity, in other words, affect, how we feel, and if we took on board social relations, how people relate to each other in groups and organizations, communities and societies, and if we tried to combine individual human affect with the way we behave in dynamic relationships to each other, with the way we behave in dynamic relationships to the environment, then we have a picture of complexity which could help us to understand how to tackle the climate emergency. So this kind of complexity has been called different things by different people. There's an author called Fritjof Capra. I highly recommend Fritjof Capra. He wrote a fantastic book called The Web of Life. And later on, he wrote this book with Luigi Luisi in 2014 called The Systems View of Life, A Unifying Vision. And in that book, Capra and Luigi Luisi discuss how the world is absolutely intertwined, entangled, and interconnected in systems and not according to individuals. That individuals, in a sense, only exist within systems. And so you can see how difficult it is, because in this graphic here on the slide, you can see how difficult it is to demonstrate an ecological or a rhizomatic or a systemic system or structure, because there are so many parts to it. And part of me says, oh, I don't want to see this. I want to see it written out in a linear fashion, please, and then I can understand it better. But of course, as I've been discussing in this lecture, that's a mistake. That's a mistake. And we have to face this kind of complexity in order to understand the unity of the system. So the interconnected web can be viewed differently in terms of time, avoiding the damaging view that progress is aligned with time. That view of history is held by many people, the idea that time moves from zero or from before zero to 2024, and each year shows a progress of humanity, more or less. And so time is progress, and therefore history is progress, which is a very wrong way of understanding the world. And it's responsible for the damage that we cause with colonial thinking, for example. The idea that people from the developed West are in some sense superior to other people because they are the protagonists of the historical progression in time. So the idea of time and history being linked to progress is a very wrong and a very damaging idea. And you know, people who think this think that progress will solve everything, including the climate emergency. Big problem. For example, the idea that science and technology will find a solution to the climate emergency can be a fantasy that's used as a defense against the anxiety of imminent destruction. So there are people, quite a lot of people, who think that a scientific invention will save us from climate change. For example, we can inject white globules into the atmosphere to reflect the sun's rays back and protect the Earth. We just have to wait for the progress. And that kind of idea is a very damaging idea, not because it might or might not happen, probably not, but not just because of that, but because as soon as you think that, you stop thinking about it. You say, oh, that's okay, we just wait for the scientists to invent something and then we'll be okay, so I don't have to worry about climate change, I can just go on the plane, drive my diesel car, that's okay, that's fine. Okay. So by engaging with the web or rhizome instead of the linear progress that is permanently historical, only by changing in intensities is it possible to be free of the illusion of time and progress. So instead of viewing humanity in time as a line, we can view humanity in a rhizomatic time, more similar to plateaus, more similar to archaeologies, more similar to rhizomes. And if we view it in that way, we understand that the differences are not differences in time and progress. The differences are just differences of moments. So, if we think about Timothy Morton and the complexity and dilemma of systems web thinking and the hyper-object of climate change. So, web thinking is problematic as a crisis for our thought structures, habits, and routines. By its very nature, the hyper-object, as we mentioned before, cannot be seen, but traditional approaches to cognition demand observation, assessment, and validation. So, I mean, if you have a hyper-object and you can't see it, that's not good for scientific observation. And yet, it's true. So, Timothy Morton asks, what is and where is this thing called global warming? Maybe it's similar to Lovelock and Margulis's Gaia theory, that sees the entire Earth as one living system. According to Morton, the hyper-object of climate change can only be seen in its fragmented effects. But these are not the same as the hyper-thing, the hyper-object of global warming. So this new thinking demands that we move away from the centrality of the human being as an all-powerful entity from which all cognition emerges, and move towards an understanding of the interconnectivity of everything, including the non-human and including the inorganic. So, I mean, if we say that the major global issues are all interconnected, we have to understand that that includes human beings. Human beings are all interconnected, and this goes against the dominant neoliberal political ideological paradigm that we're living in the present, where an emphasis is given to individuals instead of to communities and relationships between people. A major feature of the difficulty of action in the climate emergency is in the fragmentation of the hyperobject, or the fragmentation of complexity that mirrors the accepted mode of research as a scientific standard. This has psychological and emotional consequences of a very damaging kind. For example, the futility, powerlessness, and loss of hope in climate scientists who adhere to the method, the scientific method, and the psychological defenses used to avoid feelings of shame, guilt, and responsibility. So climate scientists attempt to be instruments in observation of objective facts. But of course, climate scientists are also human beings, and they might feel things like guilt for not being able to change the world, shame for being unable to speak up, and responsibility as people with the knowledge for getting the message across. They might feel these things because they're human beings as well as being climate scientists. And here's a quotation from a climate scientist quoted in Rosemary Randall and Paul Hoggett's chapter in a book. And here the climate scientist says, I mean, what scientists do is they pick up a bit of the jigsaw and they work at it, the little bit, in the hope that other people are working on other bits. And in the end, someone, or some way, it will be put together and will understand the picture. So the scientist works on a little bit of the jigsaw, thinking that someone else is working on another little bit. It's not the responsibility of this little bit and that little bit to create the whole, because the scientist is specialized in an area. But some way, somehow, someone, who? We don't know. But not me. Someone else will give us the picture. So I don't have to worry. I don't have to feel shame. I don't have to feel guilt. I don't have to feel responsibility because I've got my little jigsaw. Someone else, somewhere, somehow will do it. So that's the way climate psychology can demonstrate the damaging effects of working in the scientific paradigm and separating the human from the scientist in this case. Okay, so in conclusion, the conclusion is to everything that I've been discussing, that actually we do need a new way of thinking to be instilled in all walks of life, academic life, civic life, political life. We all need to change the way we're thinking. There's a need for a revolution in structures of thinking and feeling. And this revolution in thinking, it must include a re-evaluation of time, history, and memory as being events in the present. A restructuring of structures of thinking and feeling that move beyond Cartesian ideas of cause and effect. A challenging of linearity and an affirmation of relatedness. At least these ways of changing the ways we think need to be taken on board. So many thanks for that. That's it.
Thank you very much, Julian. Perguntas, gente? Comentários? Fiquem à vontade para falar em qualquer língua que vocês queiram. Português, inglês, espanhol, o professor também conhece. Só pedimos que vocês falem devagar para falar, porque o professor tem um problema auditivo, ele não entende muito bem. Pessoal que está nos vendo online, também fiquem à vontade para mandar pergunta ou para escrever no chat.
Ainda. I was wondering, as I was listening to you, let's say that we had like a meteor coming right to the Earth, and we knew 100% that we were going to be destroyed. But we just don't know how long it will take. So I was wondering, as I was listening to you, if a scientist would care for studying I don't know, would be making equations or studying this phenomenon. If it's certain that at the end we will be destroyed anyways. So, I mean, this is of course a reduction, as you just said, but I think there's a lot of anxiety about the possibility of complete destruction. And this, I'm sure that this affects a lot of us in the science. Just, just some thoughts.
So do you have a question associated to that?
It's just a comment that, I mean, it made me think about it.
Yes.
And it all made it more clear.
Yeah. I think that one of the major issues and problems with something like the hyper-object is it's very frightening to know that something exists but you can't see it. That's almost the definition of fear.
Mm-hmm.
So the tendency that we have when faced by fear is to somehow avoid the fear.
Mm-hmm.
For example, you might call it denial, or you might say, I can't do anything about it, disavowal.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to accompany the new thinking with compassion and care. And we need a society that takes more consideration of the feelings that people have. I think we live in a very hard society, which is resonating with the hard paradigm of science and thinking and thought, and care and compassion and emotions and feeling are regarded as weaknesses. So you can see this, for example, in the figure of someone like Donald Trump. He has no compassion for immigrants and refugees, for example. He has no compassion for women. He has no compassion for people who are suffering. For him, those people are losers. And the same would be true of if we have a fear and an anxiety associated to the awfulness of something that we know is there, like climate change, but we can't actually see it. And we associate the thing that we can't see with awful consequences, maybe not for us, but maybe for our children. And so we need to, yes, deal with solutions, but also we need to deal with our feelings. And so we need to have a society that is able to do both things, to deal with actual solutions to the problems in a practical sense, but also to deal with how we feel about these things. So we need a compassionate society and a caring society, as well as a society that can bring real solutions to real problems, even if we can't see those problems directly. So we're talking about a proper revolution. For me, it's a kind of revolution that's almost an evolution. You know, the idea that the human being can now evolve into a more compassionate way of living should be an evolution of the human condition.
Nossa, deixa eu falar em português aí, alguém? Só tentando pegar um gancho nisso que você está discutindo sobre a gente viver de uma maneira um pouco mais de compaixão. Muito do que a mídia traz sobre mudança climática, emergência climática, etc., acaba conduzindo para soluções individuais. Então, se a gente também fizer essa mudança, né, de chave, não sei como explicar isso, de uma sociedade que olhe mais o todo, e talvez essas soluções que comecem a aparecer também encaminhem para soluções mais comunitárias, vendo mais soluções mais amplas, né, que não mirem tanto o indivíduo.
Did you get that, Julian?
I didn't understand.
Yeah, it's just saying that in general, popular science in general, in outreach initiatives, when the issue of climate change is explained to the public, the solutions that are proposed are solutions that focus on individual action, but put a lot of burden on what we can do individually. And maybe by changing this mindset in a broader way, communicationally speaking, we can probably strive for solutions that take the community into account.
I thank you for that, because I think that's a very important aspect. I think individualism and individuality is a problem, not a solution for climate change. So, for example, I might be the perfect individual. I might have an electric car, which is powered by renewable energy. I might reduce all my waste. I might be a vegan and not eat any meat. I might never fly a plane. And the actual effect of this on climate change is almost nothing. But the effect on me as an individual is to say, I've done what I can, now I can relax. And that's very damaging, because it's in fact a defense mechanism, very often psychological defense, against participating in the common problem. Yeah? If I do everything I can, then I don't have to be worried, I don't have to be ashamed, I don't have to feel I'm irresponsible, I don't have to feel anything negative about me, because I'm doing what I can. And so if everything is focused on the individual, as it often is, then, not only is it almost irrelevant to the big picture, but it's also quite damaging to what I can contribute to the common whole. So actually, that's a very, very important issue.
Julian, we have a question from people online. This one is from Zara. How can understanding the psychological barriers to climate action, like denial and fear, help us create communication strategies that not only raise awareness, but also encourage long-term changes in behavior for environmental sustainability?
So how can understanding psychological barriers to climate action like
Like denial and fear?
like denial and fear, yeah. So how can understanding psychological barriers to climate action like denial and fear help us create communication strategies that not only raise awareness but also encourage long-term changes in behaviour for environmental sustainability? Well, I think one of the problems in the question is the idea of behaviour change. We shouldn't begin with the idea of changing behaviours. We should begin with the idea of altering perceptions of what it means to be a human being in society. Because when you change behaviours, you go back to the problem of the individual. So, for example, a politician might say, right, we have a campaign to reduce the time that a person will have a shower every morning. Okay, so instead of 15-minute shower, now you change your behavior and you have an 8-minute shower. But the problem is that is just one item associated to behavioral change, which is not connected to an understanding of how all of the different aspects of the problem are interlinked and connected. So talking about behavioral change, normally associated to the individual, is almost like giving an opportunity to fragment the problem into a series of potential behavior changes. The way to tackle climate change is to understand the system and understand the whole aspect of it, rather than to change little aspects of behavior, which can also lead to what we've seen before, in some respects a little bit negative. Okay, I only have a 5-minute shower, therefore that decreases my carbon emission by this %, therefore I am good. And I can relax, etc., etc. So I think that's really important. And I think what the psychosocial approach and the complexity approach says is that all your behaviours will naturally change if you have an increased understanding and a mutually supportive system where the commonality of the issue is related to the commonality of the problem. And then everything changes, not just the individual bits of behaviour, but everything you do changes. So I don't know if that answers the question. I think it's a complicated question because, of course, I'm not saying that you shouldn't change your behaviour. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying that there are dangers in fragmented aspects of behaviour change. And it's okay and it's good if you change your individual behaviour, but it mustn't distract us from the central issue. And of course, you can create negative things through this. For example, I live in the UK in an area where it's difficult to have an electric car. Okay? I want an electric car, but it's a real problem. There are not many charging points where I live. But someone who lives in London has many charging points. So is the person who lives in London, who changes its behaviour by buying an electric car, better than me? You know? And so So yes, changing of behaviours, but not in the way that we think about it today, I think is the point. And I think that's the point of the psychosocial. It embraces the holistic instead of specifying the fragments.
Maybe I'll ask a question on my own, Julian. I'd like to go back to your idea of the machine when you talked about René Descartes. Yeah, he had this idea, as you said, the human mind working as a machine, like clockwork. Yeah, but I was thinking that our relationships with machines have changed a lot, due in no small part to the kinds of thinkers you cited. Deleuze and Guattari themselves have a very different concept of machine as something that not only encompasses the apparatus, but also people using it and being affected by it. There's the school of cybernetics that was a major influence in the web of life and complexity theory in general. And then Harris thinking the whole post-human tradition, all of that. So I was thinking, yes, we live under this illusion that technology will save us, some sort of deus ex machina. We cannot rely on that. But how do you think we should deal with technology in this situation? I know we had a conversation about technology yesterday, and you said that you yourself, in a way, is a cyborg because you rely on AI to communicate. So I think you might have a very nuanced idea about that.
Yes. Well, I mean, that's a very interesting question. And of course, if I take a psychosocial approach, I'm immediately going to say that we must never see things in terms of dualities, all right? So it's not human affect good, technology bad. It's never, you must never get into the binary or the duality of those things. But we must remember that the technology is at the service of the biological system. I think that's a very important thing to remember. It's not a substitute for, it's at the service of. And that's one of the issues of artificial intelligence. The issue and the fear that one day artificial intelligence will take over the human condition and the condition of the universe and so on. So, I mean, technology is obviously a wonderful thing. And as you pointed out, I personally rely on technology with the cochlear implant and with artificial transcription. So I think technology is wonderful and it's an amazing thing. But of course, from a psychosocial perspective, we mustn't be dependent on technology as if technology is the second coming, as if technology is the savior, as if, in the past we had Jesus Christ and in the future we have technology that will save us from the climate emergency. That, of course, is a big mistake, which is the mistake that a lot of people are engaged with, in particular, people in the ideological conservative right are very keen to say it doesn't matter about climate change because we will find a technological solution to solve it. And that, of course, has lots of problems and issues associated with it. Another issue associated with it, which is a human affective issue, is it stops us thinking about human beings. It stops us creating the compassionate society. If technology can do all these things, then we don't really have to worry about the inferior aspects of the human being, the complicated emotions, the difficult feelings, the illogical thoughts that people have. We can forget about those and replace it with technology. And, I think that would make us a very unhappy race. And climate psychology, the complexity, the hyper-object of climate change is not just about reducing carbon emissions and making sure that the global warming doesn't exceed 1.5, 2 degrees. It's not just about that. It's about what it means to be living happily as a human being. So does the new technology make us happy? Does the new technology make us compassionate? Maybe not. Not necessarily. It's not a given. So it's an addition to the complexity of things. It's a very good question, and it's an open question because, of course, it's in the future. Yeah.
As you say, we're working hypotheses, right?
Yes, good example, working hypothesis.
Mais alguma questão, gente? Pessoal que está assistindo, a gente do online, mais alguma questão?
Eu acho que eu vou tentar fazer uma pergunta, se eu não conseguir, eu passo para você, tá? Se minha vida estiver muito complicada. Julian, I take part of several groups of the people with compassion and good intentions that wants to fight climate change. But when it's easy to note that these groups means we have a little number of people meaning with the climate change and all the days and concerned about, and the other members of the group more detached, more linked to the quotidian questions and interesting to read news and to know news, bad informations, and saying, oh my God, but not all the time attentive to the meetings and to be together to discuss and to acting. So we have the way the human beings are, something I imagine like individuals linked with each others, but in the present, our lives put us in a different position, not as a rhizomatic form, but in a hierarchical one. So even in the movement against climate change, we have an hierarchy not imposed by leadership, but by the common way of living in society. So, do you know in practice some movement against climate change that could face this kind of difficulties, that put the people together, meaning the situations around actions, plans, little plans to act, because the groups I take part, they plan actions, but they are not able or strong enough to put even all the members of the group together to these actions, that actions. It's possible to understand, Vinicius, how do you think?
Did you get that, Julian? You want me to paraphrase?
So your question is that these groups don't have the capacity, or they're not strong enough to gather together
No.
to take actions.
Não, eu vou repetir, mas assim, o que você acha que está trabalhando? Mas não, só uma perguntinha. Olha, você disse para o professor o seguinte, eu faço parte de vários grupos em que a gente tem pessoas reunidas que querem, são grupos de combate, de enfrentamento à mudança climática.
She takes part in groups that are ostensibly made up of people trying to enact practical measures against climate change.
Esses grupos elaboram ações, mas a maioria das pessoas só observa as discussões, elas não participam, elas estão interessadas, elas estão preocupadas, mas elas levam para um pequeno grupo lá dentro de pessoas mais envolvidas a reflexão e a ação, e elas só acompanham como observadoras. E eu queria saber se ele conhece algum grupo que rompeu com essa estrutura, porque me parece que isso se repete.
So basically, those groups, they have very good ideas, they have plans, but within the groups, the acting body is just a small fraction of the total number of members. Most people, they participate, but they just observe. They don't actively take part in the organization. And she wants to know if you know any example of a group initiatives, collective initiatives, where this internal hierarchy within the groups have been broken, where everybody takes part, even if only in small measures for the overarching purpose.
Can I just ask, what do you mean by an internal hierarchy?
There's some people who do things who like they take an active role in organizing and coming up with ideas, and a lot of our other members that just observe it. They don't have the initiative, or they feel gifted somehow and don't actively, you know.
Vinícius, é uma questão sobre como as pessoas se organizam, porque ele falou da complexidade dos indivíduos na relação com a sociedade e como essa complexidade envolve relações intersociais. Só que na prática a gente tem elementos hierárquicos que talvez sejam históricos e não inerentes à maneira como os seres humanos se organizam e progridem juntos, que interferem. Se ele conhece situações em que isso se rompe, então eu imagino que à medida que isso se rompa, a gente vai ter uma maior aproximação entre os grupos, e aí a interconexão entre os diversos grupos vai ser maior. O que eu observo? Excuse me, Julian. As pessoas estão adoecendo, e elas só vão, o nível do adoecimento está aumentando nesses grupos, o nível do adoecimento só vai diminuir à medida que elas observarem que elas têm uma proximidade de interconexão muito concreta, que não se realizou ainda, mas ela é possível, entende? Por isso que mudar dessa posição para essa é importante para mim. Ficou mais claro o que eu estou dizendo?
Sim, agora eu vou falar.
Como os grupos se organizam?
Eu vou falar e você me...
Tá.
So in many things, there's something more serious going on here. The fact that you have, you know, these small numbers of decision makers and everybody else just observes, and also the fact that different groups struggle to act collectively, you know, to cooperate with one another, might be a result of ways we have been trained to act socially in a historical perspective. So we came to internalize some sense of hierarchy and passivity, and we struggle to break these conventions when we are organized in groups for climate change.
Minha pergunta não é nem como que se faz isso, mas se conhece alguns exemplos práticos que ele poderia citar para a gente observar mais de perto. Mas se não tiver claro, também fala para ele que eu vou mandar por escrito.
She wants to know if you know any group that had issues like this with internal hierarchies or with difficulties in getting a message across different groups, and if you know any benchmark cases that you could mention. And she also said that if you did not understand the question correctly, she would just write it down and send you via email later.
Well, I think that what this question is really about is a question of how we organize our society. So, to me, that question is about who makes decisions, how do we govern ourselves, what actions can be created by people as opposed to the people who have status and authority and power. In other words, I think that there's a need, and you can see the beginnings of this in the United Kingdom. There's a need for a change in what we understand to be governance and democracy. So if you think of something like participatory democracy, is normally exemplified by things like citizen assemblies, where citizens can get together and together can take a decision on something of value and importance to them, their community and the society. But our society today is very much based on the kind of democracy, the representative democracy, where somebody is voted into a position of representation, and that creates the hierarchy, and the person acquires a status and an authority to take the decision on behalf of others. And that increases the feeling of passivity or powerlessness of people who are not represented in that democratic pattern. So just like we need a new way of thinking, that new way of thinking needs to be accompanied by a new way of governing decision-making, discussion, a new way of understanding hierarchy. I think the idea of a natural hierarchy I find a bit disturbing. It seems to me that a hierarchy is an unnatural, not a natural thing, and that if it exists according to attitudes that are embedded in people, primitive attitudes of power, status, and so on. But if we take an ecological position, we understand that the bee is as important as the mountain. And that kind of understanding is an understanding we can bring to people with different abilities and faculties, and not to give a higher status to people with a particular ability, but understanding and respecting that different people have their own qualities and abilities, and that therefore hierarchy in the sense of someone being better than someone else is primitive and damaging. So difference is not the same as hierarchy. It's possible to have difference which is respected in a participatory democratic fashion, but it doesn't have to result in hierarchy. And so, when you think of the way businesses are organized, for example, you might imagine that a cooperative business where people engage in cooperative decision-making and cooperative governance, governed by principles and values, in other words, by human importance and affect and social needs, as opposed to purely financial and economic needs. That kind of way of governing a business, for example, would recognize the difference between people, but would not place them in a hierarchy, because each person will have the same input in terms of decision making, even if that person is less gifted in one aspect or in another aspect. And I think the disempowering of people in our society is a huge challenge, and it's a shameful situation, I think, when you consider that there are so many people in our society who feel they have no influence, no power, no agency to do anything. And not only that, they don't deserve it because they're not in a hierarchy. So I think along with new thinking, we need new systems and new structures and ways of being. And I would say that a compassionate thinking would encourage a different way of relating to each other. So, I mean, there are some obvious examples and there are some subtle examples. An obvious example would be, for example, I have worked for many years in a scholarly place, therefore I have a level of culture and ways of thinking that someone else might not have, but I'm never going to win a gold medal in the Olympic Games. So we're just different, we're not, and that's a silly sort of big example, but in different, more nuanced levels, I think we can celebrate difference and diversity instead of putting them in hierarchical structures. And I would say that that's a measuring stick for civilization. So the progress that we've made in incorporating, for example, disability and ethnic difference is important in the way of working in that sense. So, you know, just because someone is disabled, for example, if someone is blind or if someone is in a wheelchair, it doesn't mean that if I concede and if I don't need a wheelchair, I am superior in a natural hierarchy to that person. You know, if a person is black and has a background of poverty from slavery, it doesn't mean that because I'm not black and I don't have that background, I'm therefore superior. That sort of natural acceptance of hierarchy. These things have to be tackled very much. And in terms of climate change, you can see how it works. The global south is the victim of the global north. The natural hierarchy is that the global north, the conquistadores and the colonial powers are higher up in the hierarchy. And the damage it causes in terms of climate is very striking. So whether you talk about it from the perspective of climate change and the planet and the global north and the global south, or whether you talk about it in terms of a small group with some people who might be disabled, some people from a different ethnic background, some people who are not very educated, some people with a lot of culture and education, so on, those need to be seen as differences and not as hierarchical differences, but as differences in fact to be celebrated within the containment of a compassionate society.
Okay.
Alguma pergunta, gente? So I think that's it, Julian. I think let's give a round of applause for our speaker.